everyone, it's been a hot minute, and I wanted to start off by saying welcome back to Chai Collective. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm your host Rithi, and in this episode we're going to be diving into mind over medicine, the placebo effect. And you've probably heard of the placebo effect, and maybe the term is thrown around in pop culture references and interviews, maybe some scientific papers as well. And the question really stems from what exactly is in a placebo. And I previously thought it was just some dummy ingredients, right? Like the dummy pill with corn syrup. And there was not much to it. There was no chemically active ingredients. And the question actually is a lot more interesting and fascinating than that. So that is exactly what we'll be discussing in this episode. And a Reuters article actually sparked my interest in this, and it was an article by Lynn Peoples, and the article title was titled, So What's in a Placebo Anyway? And it really revealed that placebos aren't as simple as we previously thought, or may have thought. And the article discusses how there's been over 150 clinical trials that have shown that patients report feeling better and report positive effects after taking a placebo, even when there is no medicinally or chemically active ingredient in the pill. And it begs the question, what is causing this positive effect, and whether there is actually a substantial difference before and after taking a placebo pill. And that's essentially what the placebo effect is in a nutshell. It's when our belief in the treatment creates a real physiological change, even when the person is not actually taking a medicine per se. And what's really interesting is that placebos aren't just these innocent dummy pills that are just made of corn syrup. They actually go much more in depth than that. And some placebos actually do cause biased results, which is interesting since the whole idea of the placebo pill is that it's supposed to serve as a control group in clinical trials and serve as a baseline to validate the effects and the other results shown in the actual medicine. And placebo effects actually aren't as neutral as they might come off as initially. And in one example, there was a heart disease study in which the placebo pills were filled with olive or corn oil. And now with modern studies, both of the ingredients, olive and corn oil, have been shown to reduce bad or lower LDL, low density lipoprotein cholesterol. So the placebo did actually cause positive effects for the heart disease patients, and it did lower their cholesterol. And that really, did skew the results since the placebos weren't as neutral as they may come off as. And a researcher, Dr. Beatrice Gollum, is quoted in the article, and she points out that there isn't evidence that anything is truly physiologically inert. And by that, there is no evidence that anything is really chemically inactive.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
That anything is really chemically inactive and really neutral in a sense. And it does beg the question, are people healing because of belief in the treatment? Or is there actually something happening in their body that is causing positive results, which was the case with the corn oil and the olive oil pills? And what's interesting is that oftentimes the same pharmaceutical companies that produce the experimental drug, which is the medicine that is supposed to have an impact, also are the same producers of the placebos. And this raises the concern of bias. There are also very few, if any, formal FDA regulations regarding what ingredients are actually used in a placebo and what constitutes a placebo pill. And very few clinical trials disclose the contents of their pills, which also raises a concern about potentially inaccurate findings in clinical studies. If they're not actually disclosing what goes into a pill, how can we be so sure that the results are valid, right, and not due to the placebo pill having an impact. And ultimately, the main takeaway from this was to urge higher levels of transparency from pharmaceutical companies regarding what actually goes into their pills. And the placebo effect may not be entirely psychological, but rather a result of the ingredients in the pill. So it might not entirely be someone's perception or just mind over matter and someone's perception of the treatment, but it might actually be a substantial difference due to the ingredients in the placebo pill itself. And this relates back to experimental hazards, which are, hazards that can be posed in experiments. And it also warns us that even well-designed experiments, an experiment that is well thought out, well drafted, well documented, can still fall victim to bias due to the involvement of human subjects and this uncertainty as to what actually is in a placebo pill, right? And that can just cause a lot of bias in clinical studies and also have an effect on the interpretation of the results of these studies. And placebo pills do also very much have a basis in psychology, and it also does show that expectations can shape our experience and in some cases entirely alter our experiences altogether. And even when the treatment is not real per se, our expectations can cause actual differences, which I thought was very interesting. It very much relates to the whole mind over matter saying and really how potent our interpretation and our perception really is and how it shapes our experiences altogether. And this effect is also observed outside of heart disease clinical trials, and one such example are clinical trials for depression. And antidepressants, for example, have been used in several studies to treat people with mild to moderate depression. And the patients responded, in some cases at least, the patients did respond almost equally as well to placebos as to the actual drugs. And just believing that the patients were getting help and were receiving medication was enough to actually cause a real emotional improvement and improved conditions. And more on an anecdotal side, I have previously heard about the placebo effect numerous times, and I previously assumed that it was mainly due to the psychology of the human mind, and I had previously thought that any positive or restorative effects that were experienced after taking the placebo were solely due to the mind manipulating one's perception. And although I haven't taken any placebos, or at least to my knowledge, or participated in any clinical trials, I've read research papers that did conclude that the placebo group or the control group actually did yield positive results. Along similar lines, I've observed a positive perception by doing certain tasks, even if they didn't directly affect my performance. And a certain example is that sometimes when I'm walking my dog at night, he's a little terrier poodle, and sometimes when I'm walking my dog at night, I will see the Orion constellation.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
I will see the Orion constellation, and I initially found out about the Orion constellation when I kind of went down this rabbit hole actually, and I had like a little constellation night sky app, and it learned to recognize the Orion constellation, and at this point I kind of know it by heart and I can instantly recognize it if it's out at night. And whenever I see the Orion constellation, I sometimes make a wish, and although this habit has no scientific basis, I mentally feel reassured and hopeful about my wish. And this is kind of similar to the placebo effect in the sense that there's really no scientific basis for any positive effects, but just a belief in the treatment, or in this case, the ritual of making a wish, is enough to actually yield positive effects, or sometimes that reassurance is enough to be considered the positive effect. And this kind of shows how the placebo effect is present in our daily lives outside of medicine, outside of like a formal clinical trial, and how sometimes we just believe in things, and sometimes they're labeled as superstitions, like we do certain things a certain way because we think it'll have a certain impact or it'll positively impact our lives. And sometimes this is true, sometimes it isn't, but just the mental reassurance is enough for us to continue doing that certain thing, which in my case would be wishing on the Orion constellation. And finally, to tie everything together, what exactly can we take away from learning about the placebo effect? So firstly, placebos may not be these innocent blank slates as we may assume. They might not be as psychologically inert as we assume. And by inert, that means chemically inactive. And it really raises the idea that placebos may not be these completely inactive pills, and they may actually have certain ingredients that do cause physiological effects, as was the case with the olive and corn oil pills. And secondly, transparency in research does matter. And finally, our beliefs and our expectations can deeply influence how we feel and even how we heal and recover from certain conditions and periods of illness, and how our belief in the treatment can actually prove to have an impact on the convalescence process of a illness or a condition, which I found really interesting since it really does bring merit to the famous mind over matter saying, and it also does show that how our beliefs do actually hold more power than we may initially presume. And that's all I have for today. Thank you for joining me on Chai Collective. And I encourage you to think about different daily rituals that you do in your life that may be seen kind of as a placebo effect, and how your mind really influences the outcome of that ritual. And yeah, that's all I have for today. I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening. And the next time someone says it's all in your head, maybe it is, and that doesn't mean it's not real. And until the next time, I'm Dhrithi. I'm your super cool host on Chai Collective, and I'll see you next time.